This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello and welcome to episode 125. I am your host, Blackstone Joe, and today we're going to get lost in the data. I know where I'm going. At least I tell that to my wife when I'm driving somewhere unfamiliar and I miss a turn on the map and I try and play it cool. Like, yeah, I know where I'm going this time. Unlike the writers of the TV show Lost. You know, that hit show from the early 2000s where strangers, they crash land on an island that happens to be surreal and mysterious and things happen. But, you know, it never really bothered me when some things went unanswered on that show because I felt like the main idea, the characters, the conflicts they ran into, the relationships they built, I got what I needed. So even with there being some unknowns, the entertainment value was always there, even if there were some things left unanswered. What does a show about strangers stranded on a mysterious island possibly have to do with an oil analysis podcast? Well, it turns out that engines can be their own source of confusion due to owners not always knowing the method to the madness of, say, manufacturer recommendations, why they may differ from one another, and what we, the owners, are left to do when confronted with discrepancies in, say, manuals for the same engine. Enter today's topic. A listener of the podcast sent this topic along. I would love to credit you specifically, but I only have your email address on hand, and I would not like to just give that out to thousands of people, but thank you nonetheless for this excellent topic suggestion because it really led us down the rabbit hole. Like I mentioned earlier, we are going to dive into some data, but it is a carefully planned exercise where we have some parameters set in place to help us arrive at a conclusion that the oil can inform. So keep that in mind. There are some aspects of this, let's just say, very wide-ranging inquiry that we have to narrow down in such a way that an oil analysis can lend some helpful insight instead of mere speculation that goes a bit beyond our wheelhouse. So without further ado, a listener of the pod found a discrepancy between Japanese and American manuals, both for the Subaru FA24F and the 2022 WRX. Importantly, the listener includes that Subaru doesn't have variations of the engine type just depending on these two differing locations. And yet, this listener found that the American owner's manual calls for 0-20 to be changed every 6 months or 5,000 miles, while the Japanese owner's manual for this same engine calls for either 0-20 or 530 with a replacement interval of every 12 months. For this Slick Talk listener, the discrepancy seemed to indicate two things. First, that U.S. fuel requirements must be resulting in manufacturers recommending lighter weight oils at cost to the consumer in the form of higher engine wear. And two, other countries around the globe with fewer restrictions are using oil that will do a quote-unquote better job of protecting the engine. These two ideas are informed by the notion that lighter weight oil is solely for fuel economy and that more viscosity would equal less wear. So that's kind of what these assertions are built upon. Here at Blackstone, we've long held to the idea that oil is oil, which is another way of saying we normally don't see a significant difference in how your engine will do just based on what you run. But when owners are told two different things for the same motor, and we coincidentally have samples ranging from 0-20 all the way up to 540 in this very same engine, well, we figured why not take a closer look and see what the numbers show. That's exactly what we did, so without further ado, it's time to dial in the data. For this exercise, we pulled data from the engine type that was included in our universal averages, which is important in that our averages are constructed so as to exclude things like wear-in samples, samples from engines with other major issues, anything that would directly influence metal content. There were a total of 448 samples, of which 392 were marked as 020 or 520, 50 were marked as 030 or 530, and 6 were marked as 040 or 540. At first glance, it appeared the idea of heavier oil offering more protection was correct, as the 20-weight oils had higher levels of iron, lead, tin, nickel, and silver compared to 30-weight and 40-weight samples. However, the average oil time for the 20-weight oils was 5,400 miles, as compared to just 3,600 miles for the 30 weights and 3,300 miles for the 40 weights. Adjusting for mileage, the 20 weights have the lowest level of wear for every element except chrome and nickel. And both of those, well, they varied by just 1/100th of a part per million, or 1 part per 100 million. So, at this point, it looked like 20 weights actually offered better overall protection. But then, we've got to take into account the average odometer mileage on the engine as well. The 20-weight samples, well, those had an average odometer mileage of 36,100 miles. But the 30 weights had an average of just 18,000, say roughly 19,000 miles on them. That means the 30 weights were from engines closer to wear-in, which could account for the higher metals. The 40 weights had an average odometer mileage of about 23,000 miles, somewhere in between the two. So, where does that leave us? Well, from the data we can obtain, there's really nothing to support the idea that 20 weights aren't protecting the engine as well as the 30 weights are. And of course, what little variation we are seeing could also be chalked up to differences that always exist from one owner to another, their driving habits, the operating conditions, and so on. So at the end of the day, there's still some interesting questions here that, much like one of my favorite science fiction television dramas, are kind of left unanswered. Why exactly does Subaru have differing recommendations? Well, it's possible environmental regulations could have something to do with it. There's also the possibility of, say, product availability playing a factor. Some markets maybe not having access, or at least enough access, to one particular weight of oil to market to their consumers, etc. But we can only speculate on that front. Our data is with the engine and the oil it's running. And on that front, you're in good shape, whether you're running a 020 or a 530. And what's more, this whole exercise kind of reinforces the idea that if you follow your manual, you're generally doing right by the engine. Even if you find that one market has a manual saying one thing and another market has a manual for that same motor telling you another. Subaru knows these engines better than anyone, and if they're saying that you can run a 020 and you can run a 530, well, in this case, we can see that both oils not only were doable, but they worked well. One thing I didn't cover earlier in this exercise is that not only are we finding that there's marginal differences, but we're looking at engines that are not simply producing healthy wear levels, but producing good trends too. So if you find yourself an owner of a 22 WRX and you're wondering what you should run, or maybe it's an entirely different motor with a different recommendation that you're wondering if it is indeed on point, let the data tell the tale. Because if you sample the oil from the engine you're running, you'll be able to see what metal content is there. If the engine is wearing like we typically see, wearing quite a bit more, developing erratic trends, well, that can inform the next step in your maintenance plan. So in this case, before I go back to finish my rewatch of Lost, after having been lost in the data all day and digging up some really interesting finds, thanks to this listener suggestion, these are all valuable insights in that it gave us a reason to really single out these differing oils. Again, we looked at samples ranging from a 020 all the way to a 540 in this particular engine type. And it was fun to see the differences and how much they varied, but there are so many factors that really explain a lot of these variations. Engines that aren't far removed from wear-in producing more metal than others. engines that had the oil in use for longer intervals that also play a role. At the end of the day, there's almost always an explanation other than the oil simply working poorly. Look at your oil change interval, look at how closely the engine is removed from wear in, and take those factors into consideration. And of course, you can rely on your sample when you send it in being compared to our averages for that engine type if you need to see exactly what's going on with your motor and the oil you're running. That brings today's show to a close. Thank you so much to our listener for this suggestion. And if you have any particular questions you would like answered in the way oil analysis can, don't hesitate to send them along. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.